Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, human rights watchdogs have slammed it as the worst of the worst. Torture is widespread, human trafficking is common, and women barely count. Now, there's no elected body that represents ordinary citizens. And yet, there he was, the U.S. President Barack Obama, cutting short his visit to India late last month to fly to Saudi Arabia to pay his respects to its new King Salman. Now, officially, according to the White House, the visit was really about reassuring a strategic ally at a rocky time in their relationship. It's a relationship that Washington sees as vital in the fight against jihadism. Now, my guest today is Sarah Hayes. She joins me from Washington, D.C. Sarah, you're a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You're also the author of a book, Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. You have helped shape U.S. policy as a former advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff on Afghanistan and also the Arab Spring in general. But I want to focus here on Saudi Arabia, and I want to ask you right away. When we saw those images of Barack Obama, he had flown over from India, where one moment we saw him lecturing the Indians, so to speak, on women's rights, on protecting religious minorities. Next moment, we see him cutting short that visit. We see him in Saudi Arabia, and he is absolutely mum on human rights issues. Why does it seem the U.S. is willing to make an exception for Saudi Arabia and keep mum like that?
I think, unfortunately, most governments are inconsistent in their application of principles that they claim to cleave to. Saudi Arabia is a particularly glaring example in two regards. One, obviously, is the world energy supply. I mean, Saudi Arabia continues to be an incredibly strategic and important player, not just with respect to U.S. energy needs, but world energy needs. I mean, oil is an internationally traded commodity, so even though the United States is much more oil independent than it was, let's say, a year or 2 years ago, that doesn't really change the impact of Saudi decisions and production on world prices, and therefore, to a certain extent, on world economic stability. So that's one piece of it. The other piece that I think is really, again, self-contradictory is, as you suggested, the United States sees Saudi Arabia as an ally in the fight against jihadism. Now, that's really interesting logic, given that one could argue that Saudi Arabia played an incredibly important part in birthing global jihadism by almost proselytizing this quite rigid Wahhabi version of Islam throughout the region. That's one way that it's contributed to global jihadism. Another way is by the very autocratic nature of the Saudi regime. If you go back and read al-Qaeda foundational literature, it's all about the injustice of the Saudi regime. So Saudi Arabia has both directly contributed to jihadism and indirectly contributed to it by creating the types of grievances that many jihadis exploit as they recruit, members of their movements.
And yet, as you yourself pointed out in a recent piece you wrote for Carnegie Endowment, the U.S. has not been totally innocent in the creation of this fundamentalist Islam. It was very much complicit, at least in the 80s and the 90s.
Absolutely.
They were helping.
Absolutely, side by side, and that piece was actually for Defense One, and indeed, the United States, in collaboration with Saudi Arabia, saw kind of religious ideology as a great antidote to communist ideology. So it's this typical, short-term thinking where you look at what the sort of boogeyman of the day is, and you're almost willing to enable any apparent antidote to it, and then, it's kind of the sorcerer's apprentice. You reap this monster a couple of decades down the line. And
you brought up an interesting point in the piece.
And to a certain extent, let me just follow up on that a little bit. To a certain extent, the United States is playing the same game today by continuing to cleave to Saudi Arabia, by not asking any questions about how that country is governed, by not really working to convince the Saudi leadership that for their own longevity, as well as for global stability, they have got to start initiating some political reform.
And this is a major point. This is perhaps the point of the piece you wrote for Defense One, that This is a golden opportunity, this transition in the House of Saud, to fix that relationship by putting real substantive reform at the top of the agenda. Why are the Saudis, what leverage does the United States have? That might sound like a naive question, but I'm really curious. What leverage does the U.S. have in convincing the Saudis to put true reform on the agenda?
I'm not sure you can talk about leverage. I'm not sure Saudi Arabia needs the United States. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't talk about it. Just because you don't have a stick to oblige someone to follow along or to follow along with advice you're giving doesn't mean you shouldn't give advice, right? And again, I think lower oil prices and increasing U.S. energy independence provides an opening, provides a degree of leeway that maybe the United States didn't enjoy in the past.
What I'm curious about is the Saudis, at least widely reported that the Saudis are furious at the U.S. for a number of things, for dropping Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, for failing to go after Bashar Assad on chemical weapons, for the rapprochement with Iran. All of these things really have them in a tizzy. Why does Saudi Arabia why do they remain such a critical ally? What's wrong with the U.S. just saying, well, we have another agenda now, and we're going to pursue that?
I think in general in international affairs, it's not a great idea to lurch from one type of relationship abruptly to another. So I am not advocating cutting off all relations with Saudi Arabia or making a pariah of Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure that would be a very helpful approach if taken too abruptly. On the other hand, I agree with your implication that, the Saudis are mad. Fine, they're mad. I mean, you try to explain it, you try to work them through what the logic and thinking process is, you try to show how a different approach on their part could lead to a warming again of this relationship. But if the United States is willing and able to stand by its fundamental principles overseas, then it's going to have to be able to put up with a little bit of blowback. So when I, in the past, have built plans and scenarios for doing something like this in a different context with a different country, where it was, let's stand up and actually condition our support and condition our aid and require some performance on political reform, part of the planning process that I went through was what are the likely countermoves by that government and how can the risk of those countermoves be mitigated? And I don't see any of that kind of sophisticated planning going on in the case of Saudi Arabia.
Now, you've made the point that Saudi Arabia has actually passed sort of a raft of anti-terror laws, laws which in practice have been used to go after really anyone who opposes the regime, any political activism. And you actually make it's counterintuitive, you say, but you make the argument that the U.S. should push for Saudi Arabia to roll back those laws. Explain that.
Well, precisely. When laws such as those are written too broadly, they then become a green light for all kinds of repression. So that is not an appropriate counterterrorism measure. And these are issues, these are not easy issues. They're ones that the United States has dealt with counterterrorism legislation here, that France is currently dealing with in the wake of the Charlie Hebdo murders. So governments need to be really careful to target legislation specifically for real acts or intended acts of terrorism and not draw that legislation so broadly that it can become a tool to repress all kinds of democracy advocates, religious minorities, and other people who are merely nuisances to the regime but not actually security threats.
Where we were talking, you mentioned before the move towards more oil independence on the part of the U.S. The U.S., I believe, is about to overtake Saudi Arabia production relatively soon. Where do you see, and I don't want to put you on the spot here, but where do you see, just from your sort of professional standpoint, this relationship in 5 years' time?
I think it's a really good question. Crystal balls are always difficult. I know they're always tempting, but more people have made errors by trying to predict than by dodging a question like that. Let me just say that It really depends on whether the United States is able to understand that its national security is better served by sticking to its principles rather than sticking to whoever happens to lead a country that's considered to be a country that's considered to be a strategic ally. So I just, mention another country in Saudi Arabia's neighborhood, Egypt. It's been really interesting to watch the United States kind of jump from one strongman to another. First it supported Mubarak, then it supported Morsi, now it supports Sisi, more or less, with very little real concern for what the United States proclaims to be its core political and human rights values. So, and in the end, I think that doesn't serve the United States' own security very well. Egypt also is rolling out anti-terrorism legislation, which is allowing for just widespread crackdowns on ordinary political dissent.
And
so for
Chayes,
Saudi Arabia,
I'm sorry, yeah, finish briefly. We're going to have to actually leave it there because Egypt's for another day, probably.
Okay, so with respect to Saudi Arabia, it really depends on whether U.S. decision makers come to understand in the wake of the Arab Spring, the Ukraine revolution, the insurgencies, Islamist insurgencies in various parts of the world, that cleaving to its core principles in the long run is the best recipe for its own national security. If it does that, then it may start, if decision makers do that, then they may start applying a little bit more conditionality on the relationship with Saudi Arabia than has been the case to date.
Sarah Chayes, I thank you so much for your time today. You're a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You're also author of Thieves of State: Why Corruption Threatens Global Security. We've been talking about Saudi Arabia, though you've also spent years in Afghanistan, know that country very well. That will be for another day, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with our viewers here on France 24. And thanks to all of you for watching the interview here, and more news coming up.